you've got interaction between plants, between animals, and between soil, and these are introduced by humans to a certain extent. So I would like to talk about crisis in terms of ecological disturbance. So for that purpose, it's an event or a force that brings about mortality or changes to spatial patterning within ecosystems. And that, for instance, can be a natural disaster or climate change. And then on the other hand, we have ecological resilience. So that's it's the ability of the ecosystems to withstand these ecological disturbances. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are raised fields? Raised fields are essentially an agriculture system that's adapted to seasonally inundated areas, wetlands, essentially. So it's a system in which you create this earthen platform, and these can be of different shapes, different sizes. They can be round, they can be elongated, and then you cultivate your cultivars on top of them, and so that when the area becomes flooded, you can still continue the cultivation. So they appear in different places in South America. So here you have a map showing you some of these. And we're going to be talking a little bit about number 12, which is Llanos de Mojos, about Ecuador, and we're going to talk quite a bit about Guyana, because that's where my study is essentially. So the earliest dates for raised fields are actually from Lake Titicaca. And so they reach a very early first millennium before Common Era. And then the latest mentions that we have come from Venezuelan llanos in the 18th century. So the first scientific studies of raised fields actually come from the 60s, and that's Llanos de Mojos. And since then, we've had a lot of research into raised fields, but it was mostly focused on interpreting aerial photography and to some extent on doing excavation. And only later, in the 90s and early 2000s, we started getting more ecological studies. Next slide, please. So let's start with looking at how natural disasters can affect these agricultural systems. So here we have an example from Hacienda Zuleta in Ecuador. And so it's interesting because we can see two different types of agriculture, of pre-colonial agriculture over there. We've got raised fields, which you can see in the drawing here, and we also have ridge and furrow cultivation. And what happens there is that there is a volcanic eruption which affects both of these agricultural systems. But what we see, you can see it in the section drawing here of the raised field. Here, number 3, that's the volcanic ash, which covers the raised fields. So what happens is the volcanic ash from the raised field gets removed much quicker than from the ridge and furrow fields, and they get rebuilt, which you can see in phase 4, much faster than in the ridge and the furrow, which proves to show that they can be very, very quickly reinstated as an agricultural system. So in that term, I guess they are resilient. Next slide, please. So now let's discuss a little bit about climate change and raised fields. So here we have Llanos de Mojos, which is in Bolivia. And so Llanos de Mojos is a very big savanna, seasonally inundated. And we have a variety of dates for raised fields from over there. And it's an enormous raised field complex. And so there's been a lot of attention to the relationship between the flooding level and the elevation of the mountains. However, it's quite interesting to see, it's been pointed out, that actually not all of the raised fields are located in areas that today are flooded. And so that brings about the question, are they in fact this very sustainable wetland agricultural system, or are they perhaps just a response to a climatic change in the past? And so it's been suggested that perhaps this is exactly that, a response to a much more frequent and higher flooding which came about as a result of El Niño and La Niña events. Next slide. And now we're going to move on a little bit to talk about the sustainability of these raised fields. And here we are looking at the Guyana littoral. And so it has been suggested many times that race fields are a highly sustainable and a highly productive system. And it's been suggested that they are that they don't that the soil under the cultivation in raised field can actually withstand much longer periods than, for instance, modern slash and burn. And so based off of that, supposed sustainability of them, we have a whole theoretical system of very well organized settlement patterns. So you can see you've got principal centers, principal settlements, and smaller settlements, and the principal settlements are being supported by these highly productive race fields. Now, this actually is very difficult to prove, the productivity and the sustainability of these race fields. So it's an interesting to think about whether or not they were actually as productive as we think. Next slide. And then finally, again, we're talking about the Guyana littoral. Race fields in Guyanas, well, the Guyanas is an area that's affected by very high annual rainfall and by strong wind. And yet, what we would expect is for the race fields to essentially deteriorate over time. But we find them in very good condition. So the question arises why that happens. Why do they not deteriorate? And it has been suggested that perhaps this essentially this human creation, right? It gets repurposed by the organisms. So it gets repurposed by ants and by earthworms, and by termites, and by plants that do not like flooded areas. And that all of these, they manage to counteract the deteriorating factors that exist in the Guyanas. And so what we're looking at perhaps is that an anthropogenic modification actually creates a new ecological niche, which is an interesting interaction between an ecosystem and a human innovation. Okay, so my case study is focused in Brazil, and especially here in the state of Amapa, where you can see my site, Sete. So it's in that area, we've got quite a lot of funerary activity and megalithic activity. However, we do not find a lot of settlement, which is interesting because we are very close to French Guiana, where you see raised fields in connotation with settlements, right? As we've seen a couple of slides ago. My research aims here are, first of all, to establish whether these raised fields that we are seeing there are in fact raised fields and not a natural phenomenon. And then later, I would like to characterize the raised fields, and then finally verify timescales, what labor input was involved in their creation and their upkeep, potentially look at productivity and sustainability, and finally look at what environmental changes in the long term they produce. So methodology is survey, excavation, and then geoarchaeological and archaeobotanical techniques. Right, next slide. So I've actually already done one season of fieldwork this July, and here you can see some of the drone photography from that fieldwork. So on the top left, you can see the raised fields, and you can see a savanna fire above them. This is natural fire, and that's being controlled by the owner of the land. And here in this photo, in the top right, you can see very sparsely located raised fields, and you can also see my excavation site. In the bottom, you can see very closely clustered raised fields, and again, a second excavation site. Next slide, please. So what have we found out during the excavation? So we found out that actually these raised fields are can be seen and are reported from the city of Amapa all the way up to Pleistocene, where my site is located, and a bit further beyond. So this is actually a different type of savanna than than the one that exists south of the city of Amapa. So perhaps there is some type of natural phenomenon going on related to the type of savanna. And then we also found out that these raised fields are actually all located in higher elevations. So that is reminiscent of Llanos de Mojos, where we also see these raised fields in higher elevations. Now, I've also noticed that there is woody vegetation that's located on top of these raised mounds. However, I do not have an actual proper count, but there is some kind of dependence between woody vegetation and raised fields. So what we also know now is that these areas have been used extensively for cattle ranching in the recent past. We've also seen the natural fires, so that puts in perspective any charcoal analysis in the future. And then finally, some of the most important things is that we've noticed that especially the top part, as you can see, is formed of earthworm clasts. And I think you can see perhaps there, you can see some of them, not very well visible. So not only earthworm clasts, but also in the top layers, you get a lot of ants. They are really inhabited by ants, which is again an interesting observation. And coming back to the ecological inheritance, but what we haven't seen is any buried surfaces, which we would expect with a anthropogenic feature. Next slide. Okay, so the questions that arise from the fieldwork at the moment are very much connected to the questions that we've been exploring through the presentation. And so, first of all, are these raised fields a response to changing climate as they are in Llanos de Mojos, perhaps? Is that something to look at? And then, because we are so close to French Guyana, where it's been said that they are so highly sustainable, productive, is this a case in Amapa as well? And if so, where are the settlements? And then another question which relates to the earthworms and the ants. How do these raised fields change the ecosystems in which they are built? How resilient are they to modern threats, which we've seen at cattle ranching? We've got fires, we've got modern climate change as well, right? And then finally, are these actually anthropogenic, what we've been looking at least my side? And so the next steps for my study are to analyze the samples that I've collected. Especially, we're going to be looking for crops, we're going to be looking for buried surfaces and any faunal disturbances that may explain why there are no buried surfaces. And then ideally, we would return for another season of fieldwork because we would like to look more closely at the links between the raised fields and the funerary sites and maybe look for the settlement sites which are absent. And perhaps collect paleoecological and paleoclimatic data. And finally, do the ecosystem assessment, look at the species diversity and so on, to look at the actual inheritance in the present ecology. Next slide, please. And next slide. Thank you very much for your attention. And